I've always been fascinated by the ocean. Ever since I was a kid growing up near the coast of Maine, I'd spend hours watching the waves crash against the rocks, imagining what mysteries lay beneath. So when I got the chance to work as a deckhand on a small fishing boat, I jumped at it. It was a modest job, but it paid well, and being out on the open sea seemed like an adventure. That's how I ended up on the Atlantic Star, a creaky old boat captained by a grizzled man named Hank. Hank had been fishing these waters for nearly 40 years, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd seen his fair share of storms. His hands were rough, his voice gravelly, and his eyes seemed distant, like they were always watching something just beyond the horizon. Our trips were long, but uneventful for the most part. We'd head out into the deep waters, lay our traps, and haul them in day after day. But there was something about the vastness of the ocean that started to get to me. At night, when the boat would settle and the engines would die down, the silence became oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the boat and the distant call of seagulls. It felt like the ocean was watching us, waiting. One night, as we were anchored miles from shore, I was on the night shift. The others were asleep below deck, and I was alone with nothing but the stars above and the endless black sea around me. I was sitting by the rail, staring out at the horizon, when I noticed something, a faint glow in the water. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of the moon, but then it started to move. The glow grew brighter, shifting just beneath the surface of the water, moving closer to the boat. My heart started to race. I leaned over the edge, trying to get a better look, when I saw them, shapes, moving through the water just beneath the surface. They were large, far larger than any fish I'd ever seen, and there were so many of them, swirling around the boat like they were circling us. For a moment, I thought maybe they were dolphins or a school of fish reflecting the moonlight, but then one of them surfaced. It wasn't a dolphin. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen. Its skin was dark and slick, and its eyes, those pale, lifeless eyes, stared right through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I ran to the wheelhouse to wake Hank. "There's something in the water," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Hank didn't even look up from his charts. "It's just the deep playing tricks on you," he muttered. "Get some rest." But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, I tried to forget about what I saw, chalking it up to my tired mind. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The ocean seemed different now, more dangerous, more alive. A week later, we set out for another trip, farther from shore than usual. The weather had turned rough, and the waves were relentless. As we fought through the storm, something hit the boat. Hard. We thought we'd hit a rock, but there were no rocks out here, just endless water. Hank and I rushed to the side to check for damage, and that's when we saw it again, the glowing shapes circling beneath us. Only this time, they weren't just circling. They were closer, too close. One of them surfaced, its gaping mouth open wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I froze, staring down at the creature as it glided past the boat. Hank grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. Something hit the boat again, this time harder, almost tipping us over. I could hear the wood creaking, groaning under the strain. We scrambled to the wheelhouse, trying to steer the boat back to shore, but the creatures were everywhere now, their dark shapes moving just beneath the surface, slamming into the hull. Panic set in. My hands shook as I gripped the rail, watching in horror as the ocean itself seemed to rise against us. Hank shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the sea and the howling wind. We were at the mercy of the ocean and whatever was lurking beneath it. We barely made it back to shore. The boat was battered, and Hank didn't say a word as we docked. We never spoke about what we saw out there, but every time I close my eyes, I see them, those shapes in the water, waiting just beneath the surface, watching. And I know one day they'll come back. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just a few pictures, maybe a peek inside, and then we'd leave. But I knew from the moment we stepped foot on the grounds of the old orphanage that we had made a mistake. The place had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. It sat at the edge of town, its crumbling walls hidden behind a thick layer of overgrown vines and trees. As kids, we'd always heard stories about it. How the children who lived there had died mysteriously, how the place was haunted, how no one ever went inside and came out the same. We didn't really believe it. Not until that night. It was my idea to go, of course. My friends, Chris and Rachel, weren't thrilled about it, but I convinced them. We were bored, and the idea of sneaking into the old orphanage sounded like the perfect thrill. I told them we'd go in, look around, take a few photos, and leave. We didn't plan on staying long. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the last light of day casting eerie shadows across the building's facade. The place looked worse than I expected. The windows were broken, the front doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the roof sagged dangerously. It was clear no one had been inside for years. Chris was the first to back out. "I don't know, man. This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably as he stared up at the building. Rachel wasn't any more excited. "Can we just get this over with?" she said, wrapping her arms around herself as the wind picked up. I should have listened to them. Something in my gut told me to turn around and leave, but I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't want to admit I was scared. "Come on," I said, forcing a grin. "It's just an old building." We climbed through a broken window near the back of the building and landed in what looked like a kitchen. The place was a mess. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Broken dishes and rusted kitchen tools littered the floor, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The silence was oppressive. Even our footsteps seemed muted. "This place is disgusting," Rachel whispered, her voice barely above a breath. We made our way through the kitchen and into the main hallway. It was long and narrow, with doorways leading off to various rooms. The walls were lined with old photos, black and white images of children, some smiling, some staring blankly into the camera. Their eyes seemed to follow us as we walked by. Chris shone his flashlight on one of the pictures. "These kids look weird," he said, his voice hushed. I stepped closer to take a look. The children in the photo weren't smiling anymore. Their faces had changed. Now they wore expressions of fear, their eyes wide and dark. "Let's just keep moving," Rachel muttered, pulling at my arm. She didn't have to tell me twice. We pressed on, moving deeper into the orphanage. Every room we passed was the same. Empty beds, overturned furniture, broken toys. But the further we went, the colder it got. By the time we reached the central staircase, I could see my breath in the air, despite it being the middle of summer. "Maybe we should go back," Chris said, his voice shaking. I nodded, ready to turn around, but then Rachel spotted something at the top of the stairs. "What's that?" she asked, pointing her flashlight up the staircase. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a small, childlike figure, staring down at us from the second floor. My heart stopped. "Who is there?" I called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there unmoving. Rachel's voice trembled. That's not a person." Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. We stared in silence, frozen by the sight of the figure. It was watching us, its head slightly tilted to the side, like it was curious, or worse, like it was waiting. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It darted across the landing and disappeared into one of the rooms. The sound of its footsteps echoed through the hallway, quick and light. That was enough for us. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice barely steady. Chris and Rachel didn't argue. We hurried back the way we came, the air growing colder with every step. The building seemed to groan around us, as if it were alive. The walls creaked, the floors shifted, and I could swear I heard whispers, faint, distant, but growing louder. As we reached the kitchen, I heard it, the sound of a child's laughter. It echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls, surrounding us. It was soft at first, almost playful, but then it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one child anymore. It was several, laughing, giggling, their voices growing higher and more frantic. We scrambled out the window, not daring to look back. The moment we hit the ground outside, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. We ran to the car, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. None of us spoke as we sped away from the orphanage, leaving it far behind. But the image of that figure at the top of the stairs, watching us, burned into my mind. We never talked about that night. Not really. We tried to pretend it didn't happen, but I could see it in their eyes. They remembered, just like I did. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The faint sound of children laughing, echoing through the darkness. Summer was supposed to be fun, bonfires, hiking, and lazy days by the lake. But this summer, everything changed. It was the summer that I learned some places are best left alone. My friends Josh, Emily, and Matt. And I decided to spend the weekend camping at a secluded spot deep in the woods. We had heard about it from a guy at the gas station. He said it was a hidden gem, miles from any trails or campsites, and that you wouldn't see another soul out there. That sounded perfect to us, an isolated weekend away from everything. The hike to the spot was rough. We had to bushwhack our way through dense undergrowth, guided only by a vague map and Josh's compass. It was well past noon by the time we reached the clearing, a flat patch of land surrounded by towering trees with a small stream running nearby. It felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods around us grew darker, and the sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. Emily was the first to notice it. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice low, barely audible over the crackling fire. "Hear what?" Matt replied, looking up from his marshmallow. "Nothing," Emily whispered. "It's too quiet." She was right. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping crickets, had all vanished. The silence pressed down on us, thick and heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of unease began to settle in. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing, and every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the circle of light. "Let's go check out the stream," Josh suggested, breaking the tension. I didn't really want to, but I wasn't about to be the only one left at camp. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the water. The stream was shallow, winding its way through the trees, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. But something felt off. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. As we stood by the water, Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on her face sent a chill down my spine. "It was probably just an animal," I said, trying to reassure myself more than her. But she shook her head. "No," she insisted, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an animal." Josh, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "Come on, it's just your imagination." But then I heard it, a faint sound like someone or something was whispering just beyond the trees. It was soft, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the woods with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the dense wall of trees, standing silently in the dark. "We should go back," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. The others nodded, and we quickly made our way back to camp. The silence followed us the entire way. When we got back, we found the fire had gone out. That shouldn't have been possible. It was burning strong when we left, and it hadn't been long enough for it to die down completely. The air felt even colder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We sat in silence for a while, huddled around the fire pit, trying to get it going again. But the woods felt different now, like the trees were watching us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. Eventually, we called it a night and retreated to our tents. I lay there, staring up at the dark canvas, listening for any sound. The forest was still, unnaturally so. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a faint noise. It was coming from outside the tent, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently tapping on the side of the fabric. My blood turned to ice. For a moment, I lay there, holding my breath, hoping it was just the wind. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving around the tent. "Josh!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But there was no response. The tapping stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the inside of the tent. But the tapping stopped. I listened, my ears straining for any sound, but there was only silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the tapping to return. But it never did. The woods were completely silent. At first light, I emerged from the tent, my muscles stiff from tension. The others were already up, looking just as shaken as I felt. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. None of us argued. We packed up camp as quickly as we could and hiked back the way we came. The forest felt like a different place now, darker, more oppressive. Every step we took seemed to echo through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the car, none of us spoke. We drove in silence, leaving the woods behind us. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been out there that night, it wasn't something we could leave behind. I've never liked tunnels. Something about the narrowness, the way the darkness seems to press in on you, makes me uneasy. But this one was different. It wasn't just a feeling of claustrophobia. It was something worse, something far more sinister. It started when I took a summer internship at a historical site in Pennsylvania. Part of the job was giving tours of the old estate and its grounds, which included a labyrinth of underground tunnels that ran beneath the property. These tunnels had once been used to smuggle goods during the Prohibition era, and over time, they'd fallen into disrepair. Most of the tunnels were off limits to the public, and for good reason. They were dark, cramped, and prone to flooding. But one of my coworkers, Sam, mentioned that there was an even older part of the tunnel system, deeper underground. It wasn't on any map, and only a handful of people knew about it. Naturally, I was intrigued. One evening after the tours had ended, Sam convinced me to check it out. "Come on," he said, his voice echoing in the dark corridor. "We'll only be down there for a few minutes. You got to see it, it's like stepping back in time." I wasn't sure, but curiosity got the better of me. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and slipped past the gated section of the main tunnel. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the walls slick with moisture. The further we ventured, the more isolated I felt. The sound of our footsteps was swallowed by the darkness, and the tunnel seemed to go on forever. After what felt like an hour of walking, Sam stopped in front of a rusted metal door. It looked ancient, the kind of door you'd expect to see in a horror movie. He grinned at me, pushing it open with a creak. "This is it," he said, stepping inside. The room beyond was small, maybe the size of a large closet, and the walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks. I shone my flashlight around, expecting to see some remnants of the past, bottles, crates, maybe even a hidden stash of whiskey. But there was nothing, just a thick layer of dust and the oppressive weight of silence. "What's the big deal?" I asked, turning to Sam, but he wasn't there. Panic gripped me as I spun in a circle, shining my light over every inch of the tiny room. There was nowhere he could have gone, no doors, no hidden passages. It was just me alone in the darkness. I called out, my voice shaky. The silence stretched on. I stepped back into the tunnel, hoping to find him just outside the door, but the hallway was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I started walking back the way we'd come, calling his name, but there was no response. The tunnel felt different now, longer, darker, colder. I couldn't remember it being this narrow before. The walls seemed to close in around me, pressing against my shoulders as I walked. I kept my flashlight trained on the path ahead, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at my gut. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere behind me. I stopped listening. The footsteps stopped too. A chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty tunnel stretching into the darkness. I quickened my pace, my breathing growing more ragged with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, following me. The footsteps started again, closer this time, and I broke into a run, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly off the walls. The tunnel seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before, leading me deeper and deeper underground. I was certain I'd passed the same junction twice now, but nothing looked familiar. I was trapped. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, matching my pace. My lungs burned, and my legs ached as I ran, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel it now. Whatever was behind me, it was getting closer. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. The tunnel had ended. In front of me was a solid stone wall, cold and damp to the touch. There was nowhere to go. My flashlight flickered, and I frantically slapped it, praying for it to stay on. But the light was fading, and the darkness crept in from all sides, pressing in on me, suffocating. And then I heard it breathing right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing just at the edge of the dying flashlight beam. Its eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't getting out of this tunnel. The flashlight went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air grew colder, heavier, and I felt a presence closing in on me, something reaching out. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, waiting for whatever was in the tunnel with me to make its move. But nothing happened. When the lights finally flickered back on, I was alone. No sign of the figure, no sign of Sam. I turned and bolted back the way I'd come, not stopping until I burst through the exit, gasping for air. I never saw Sam again. No one did. The police searched the tunnels for weeks, but found no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I've never gone back into those tunnels. I never will. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that figure in the dark, and I wonder if it's still down there, waiting for someone else to find it. It was late, later than I'd ever been out in the city by myself. The subway station was nearly deserted, except for a few stragglers waiting for the last train. I'd missed my bus home, and taking the subway was my only option if I didn't want to walk miles through the dark streets. I could hear the faint hum of the city above, but down here, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I sat on the cold metal bench, my headphones in, but I wasn't listening to music. I was too aware of the emptiness around me, of the stale air and the distant drip of water from the ceiling. Every now and then, the station lights would flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I kept glancing down the platform, hoping to see the train lights in the tunnel, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of tracks disappearing into the darkness. I checked my phone for the time, 2:12 a.m. The train was supposed to have arrived 10 minutes ago, but there was no sign of it. I sighed and leaned back, trying to shake off the growing unease gnawing at my gut. Something didn't feel right. I noticed a man sitting at the far end of the platform. He hadn't been there when I first arrived. He was hunched over, wearing a dirty, oversized coat, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood. I couldn't tell if he was asleep or just sitting there watching. Something about him made my skin crawl. The man shifted slightly, his head tilting just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes, wide, unblinking, were fixed on me. I tried to ignore him, telling myself I was just being paranoid. People get weird on the subway at this hour. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls. I turned my head slightly, and there he was, standing now, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, his gaze still locked onto me. The platform was empty except for the two of us, and I realized, with a jolt of fear, that he was walking toward me. My throat went dry, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in, my pulse quickening with every step he took. He wasn't stopping. I stood up, trying to act casual, like I hadn't noticed him, but my legs felt like jelly. I glanced down the tracks one more time, silently willing the train to arrive. Nothing, just the oppressive silence and the faint sound of his footsteps getting closer. I took a few steps toward the station exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to run, not yet, but I could feel the fear rising in my throat. The man was closer now, his footsteps quickening to match my pace. I could feel his eyes on my back, like they were burning through my skin. I reached the stairs and practically sprinted up them, 2 at a time. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I burst through the exit and out into the street. The cool night air hit my face, but it didn't help. The man had followed me up the stairs, his pace steady and unhurried. He wasn't running, but somehow that made it worse, like he knew I had nowhere to go. I glanced up and down the street. It was empty, not a soul in sight. The nearest building was an old, boarded-up shop, and there were no open stores or taxis. I was completely alone, trapped. He was only a few steps behind me now. I could hear him breathing that slow, deliberate sound, and out. I bolted down the sidewalk, my shoes slapping against the pavement, not daring to look back. But I could hear him, his footsteps calm, almost casual, as if he had all the time in the world. I turned a corner, and suddenly, the streetlights flickered out. The entire block plunged into darkness. I skidded to a stop, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything, not even the street in front of me. My breath caught in my throat, and I listened, straining for any sound, any clue as to where he was. But there was nothing, just the silence and my own frantic heartbeat. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my hand brushing the cold brick wall of a building, trying to find my way in the dark. My legs trembled with each step, and I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. He couldn't have just disappeared, could he? Then I heard it again, the soft crunch of gravel beneath a shoe. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around, trying to see through the blackness, but it was no use. He was there somewhere, watching, waiting. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" Silence. The darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating, like it was swallowing the street whole. I took another step backward, but my foot hit something solid, and I stumbled. I turned, my eyes barely adjusting in time to see what I had tripped over. A subway entrance. The same entrance I had just come from. Panic surged through me. How had I ended up back here? I had run in the opposite direction. My head spun as I tried to make sense of it, but there was no time. The footsteps were back, louder now, closing in. Without thinking, I dashed down the stairs into the subway station. It was the only place to go. The lights flickered on as I reached the bottom, illuminating the platform. It was empty again, completely still. And then I saw him standing at the far end, right where I had been sitting just moments before. His hood was still up, his face still hidden in shadow. But now, he was holding something, a small object, glinting in the faint light. It was my phone. I reached into my pocket, but it was gone. Somehow he had taken it. My heart pounded as I backed away, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The train finally pulled into the station, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. I didn't wait. I jumped into the train, my body trembling, and pressed the button to close the doors. They slid shut just as he stepped onto the platform, his head slowly turning to face me. For the first time, I saw his eyes, cold, empty, and inhuman. The train lurched forward, pulling away from the station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, some way, he'd find me again. The first time I heard about the old amusement park, it was from a few locals in a diner on the outskirts of town. They spoke about it like a ghost from the past, abandoned and forgotten for over 30 years, yet still standing somewhere deep in the woods. The park was called Riverside Funland, and once it had been the pride of our small town. Now, though, it was nothing more than a crumbling memory, a place where the laughter had faded and silence had taken root. I don't know what made me want to go. Maybe it was the stories, the sense of mystery, or maybe it was just boredom. Either way, I convinced a couple of friends, Jason and Brooke, to join me on a little adventure to check it out. We packed some snacks, flashlights, and headed out one late afternoon. The directions weren't exactly clear, but after driving down a series of dirt roads and hiking through a dense patch of woods, we found it. Riverside Funland, or what was left of it. The rusting gates were still there, hanging crookedly on their hinges, the sign barely legible through the vines and moss that had claimed it. "This place is creepy," Brooke muttered, shining her flashlight over the dilapidated entrance. Her voice carried a hint of unease. Jason, ever the skeptic, smirked. "It's just an old park. Let's check it out." We stepped through the gates, and it felt like we'd entered another world. The rides were still there, barely. The Ferris wheel loomed over the park, its skeletal frame creaking in the breeze. The carousel was missing most of its horses, and the ones that remained were cracked, their paint peeling away to reveal dull, lifeless eyes. A cold wind blew through the park, and with it came the unmistakable scent of rot and decay. "I don't like this," Brooke whispered, hugging her arms. I couldn't blame her. The place was unsettling, like it was frozen in time, yet somehow alive with the memories of those who had once roamed here. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park. The light seemed to struggle to reach this place, like it was being swallowed by the darkness creeping in. "Come on, let's at least check out the roller coaster," Jason said, heading deeper into the park. I hesitated, but followed. The coaster had been the main attraction once, towering over the rest of the park with its twisting metal tracks. Now, it was little more than a rusting hulk, the cars frozen mid-ascent on the first hill. The entire structure groaned as the wind picked up, sending an eerie creaking through the air. Jason climbed up onto the platform, grinning. "Think we could get this thing going?" "Don't even joke about that," I said, glancing around. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Let's just look around and get out of here." Brooke stayed close to me, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard people used to say the place was haunted," she said quietly. "That some of the workers died here when it shut down." Jason rolled his eyes. "There's no such thing as ghosts, Brooke." We wandered around for a while, taking in the sights of the broken-down attractions and decaying buildings. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a distant whisper or the faint sound of music. But every time I turned to listen, it was gone. The silence was thick, pressing down on us like a weight. It wasn't until we reached the old fun house that things took a turn. The entrance was still intact, the clown face above the doorway grinning wickedly, its paint faded and chipped. Jason, being Jason, insisted on going inside. "Come on, it's just an old fun house," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't want to go, but I wasn't about to let him go in alone. We stepped inside, and the smell hit us immediately, a musty, sour odor that clung to the walls. The place was a maze of mirrors and dark hallways, the air cold and still. Brooke stayed close, her grip on my arm tightening as we made our way through the narrow corridors. The mirrors were filthy, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something that wasn't right. A shadow moving where there shouldn't be one, or a figure in the reflection that didn't belong to any of us. "Did you hear that?" Brooke whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. I had heard it too, a faint laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the funhouse. Jason stopped ahead of us, frowning. "Okay, that's not funny." "I didn't laugh," I said, my voice tight. A cold sweat had broken out on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the mirrors around us lit up, and the sound of carnival music blared through the funhouse, tinny and distorted. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows as the music grew louder and louder, an unbearable cacophony that made my head spin. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Brooke's hand and pulling her back toward the entrance. Jason was right behind us, his face pale, no longer the skeptic. We stumbled out of the funhouse and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The music had stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the park in an eerie silence once more. We didn't stay long enough to find out what had caused it. We ran, sprinting back through the gates and into the safety of the woods, not stopping until we reached the car. We never talked about what happened that night, but sometimes when I'm alone, I can still hear it, the faint sound of carnival music drifting on the wind. It was supposed to be just another night shift at the gas station. I'd taken the job because I needed the extra cash, and the overnight shift seemed easy enough. Stock the shelves, clean up, and occasionally deal with a customer. But that night was different. It was past midnight, and the roads were completely deserted. The only light came from the flickering neon sign out front, casting long shadows across the lot. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, when I noticed it, A car, an old, beat-up sedan, pulled into the lot. The headlights were off, and it rolled to a stop near the far pump, just out of range of the security cameras. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably someone who needed gas and didn't want to be noticed. We got all sorts of people through here, especially at this hour. But when no one got out of the car, that's when I started to feel uneasy. I watched for a minute, waiting to see if someone would step out, but the car just sat there, engine idling quietly. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up from the counter, peering out the window to get a better look. The windows were tinted, too dark to see inside. I took a step back. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just waiting for someone. But then I heard it, the soft ding of the door chime. Someone had come in. I turned, expecting to see the driver, but the store was empty. The door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges, and the cold night air swept in. I stared at the open door for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anyone walk in. The door had opened on its own. I slowly approached the door, my eyes scanning the empty lot. The car was still there, the engine still running, but the door to the store was wide open, as if someone had come in but never stepped through. I shut the door, locking it this time, and returned to the counter. My hands were shaking. I couldn't explain what had just happened, and that made it worse. The rational part of my brain told me it was nothing, just a gust of wind, but the fear gnawing in my gut told me otherwise. I tried to go back to reading, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept darting to the security monitor, checking the empty lot, checking the car. It hadn't moved. The longer I stared at it, the more unsettled I felt. Then, without warning, the lights inside the store flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the flashlight under the counter. The darkness felt suffocating, like it was closing in around me. I flicked the flashlight on and swept it across the store. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing near the back of the store, half hidden in the shadows. My heart nearly stopped. They were just standing there, completely still, their face obscured by the darkness. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling. "We're closed. You need to leave." No response. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "You need to get out," I said a little louder this time, trying to sound authoritative. But my voice cracked, and the figure took a step toward me. I froze. Something was wrong. The way they moved, it wasn't natural. Slow, deliberate, like they were studying me, waiting. I backed up, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure moved closer, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. I still couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze, cold and menacing. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes darting around the store. There was no one there. The aisle was empty, the back of the store deserted. I rushed back to the counter, grabbed my phone, and called the police. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. I needed someone to come check this out. But as I stood there, waiting for the call to connect, I glanced at the security monitor. The car was gone. It hadn't made a sound, hadn't pulled out of the lot or driven off. It was just gone, like it had never been there at all. When the police arrived, I explained what had happened. They searched the store, the lot, the surrounding area, but they didn't find anything. No sign of the figure, no sign of the car. They told me it was probably just my imagination, that working these late shifts can mess with your head. But I know what I saw. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't stay there. Couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. That night, I locked the door behind me and never went back. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I think about that car. I think about the figure in the store. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shadow, a flash of movement, just out of sight. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to pull into the wrong gas station at the wrong time. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, cursed objects. They were all just myths, figments of overactive imaginations. That was until I moved into my grandmother's house after she passed away. Grandma had always been a collector of strange things. Her house was filled with antiques, old clocks, dusty books, porcelain dolls with glassy, vacant eyes. Growing up, I'd always found the place unsettling, but I never thought much of it. After she died, I inherited everything, including the house and all its contents. The first few days living there were uneventful. I spent most of my time going through her things, deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. It was while I was clearing out one of the guest rooms that I found it, a small, intricately detailed porcelain doll tucked away in a box in the closet. The doll had curly blonde hair, painted blue eyes, and was dressed in a frilly, old-fashioned gown. I almost left it there, but something about it drew my attention. The doll seemed to watch me, even though I knew that was impossible. Its eyes followed me as I moved around the room, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I picked it up. The name Clara was etched into the base of its stand. I couldn't explain it, but the doll made me uncomfortable, like I wasn't alone in the room. Still, I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I placed the doll on a shelf in the hallway and went about my business, trying to forget the eerie feeling it had given me. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something, a faint tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound was soft but insistent, coming from somewhere down the hall. I sat up, listening intently. The tapping continued, slow and steady, and I realized it was coming from where I had left the doll. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses make noises all the time. But there was something deliberate about this sound. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and crept down the hallway. The tapping grew louder as I approached the shelf where Clara sat, her blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. The tapping stopped the moment I reached for the doll. The air around her felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I stared at her for a moment, then shook my head. I was being ridiculous. I turned and headed back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. All night, I felt uneasy, like there were eyes on me. The next morning, I found the doll in a different spot, on a table in the living room, even though I was certain I had left it in the hallway. I stood there, staring at it, trying to rationalize how it could have moved. Maybe I'd put it there and just didn't remember, or maybe someone had come in during the night as a cruel joke, but I knew no one had been in the house. I was the only one with a key. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. The doll would move, sometimes just a few inches, sometimes to entirely different rooms. I'd hear faint whispers, like someone was trying to speak, but I couldn't make out the words. I'd catch glimpses of shadows in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. One night, I woke up to the feeling of something cold brushing against my arm. My eyes snapped open, and I saw it, Clara, sitting on the edge of my bed, her glassy eyes staring straight at me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. I grabbed the doll and threw it across the room, the porcelain face shattering as it hit the wall. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief, but then the air grew impossibly cold, and I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, echoing through the room. I bolted out of bed, heart racing, and rushed downstairs. I needed to get out of the house, to escape whatever was happening. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut on its own. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could feel something watching me, something malevolent. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and called a friend, telling him everything. He arrived within minutes, and together we managed to pry the door open. As soon as I stepped outside, the oppressive feeling lifted, and I could breathe again. I didn't go back into that house for weeks. I stayed with friends, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, I called in a professional, someone who specialized in removing cursed objects. They took Clara away, but the expert warned me that sometimes objects like that leave behind an imprint, a shadow of their presence. It's been a year since then, and I've moved out of that house. But sometimes at night, I still hear it, a faint tapping like fingernails against wood. And every time, I wonder if Clara is still out there, waiting for her chance to come back. Hey there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you